There was a particular quality to the light that fell through the tall windows of Benjamin Lowe's workshop on Charter Street in Salem, Massachusetts. In the early morning hours, when the sun came at an angle that turned the brass fittings of surveying instruments into small fires and made even dust seem like something worth measuring. Thomas Marsh had stood in that light hundreds of times over 3 years, watching Benjamin work with the silent intensity of a man for whom a single misplaced decimal could unravel months of labor. On the morning of May 3, 1849, Thomas stood in that same light and felt his stomach turn over. The workshop was perfect. Not clean. Benjamin kept it clean as a matter of professional necessity. Perfect. The kind of perfect that comes at the end of something, not in the middle of it. Thomas set his leather satchel down by the door and did not move further into the room. He had learned in 3 years to read Benjamin's workspace the way other men read ledgers. The state of the drafting table told you what survey was active. The position of the instruments told you whether fieldwork was imminent or recently completed. The slate board beside the window, where Benjamin worked through calculations in chalk that he would later transfer to ink, told you whether he was satisfied with his measurements or still refining them. This morning, the drafting table held a single compass rose template, centered with the geometric precision Benjamin brought to everything and nothing else. The instruments were in their mahogany cases, each one bedded in fitted velvet, latches closed. The slate board had been washed clean, the wooden frame still slightly damp. Thomas walked slowly to the wide pine work table that dominated the center of the room. Last week, he had been here last Tuesday, he was certain of it. This table had held the coastal survey for the Salem Harbor Commission spread across its entire surface, held flat by brass weights at each corner. Benjamin had been verifying the depth soundings against tidal charts, cross-referencing them with astronomical tables to account for the moon's phase. Tedious work, the kind of work that took days. The table was empty. The brass weights sat in their felt-lined box on the shelf where they lived when not in use. Thomas opened the box and touched one of the weights. It was cold, not room temperature cold. The cold of brass that had been sitting untouched long enough to lose any warmth from human handling. He turned to the tall cabinets along the eastern wall. 6 of them, oak, built to Benjamin's specifications by a carpenter who had later told Thomas, with a kind of resigned admiration, that he had never met a man who cared so specifically about the internal dimensions of storage furniture. Benjamin had wanted shelves at precise intervals. He had wanted the doors to close flush, with no gap that might admit dust or moisture. He had wanted locks on all of them. Good locks, the kind that required real keys, not the decorative brass nonsense most people put on cabinets. Normally, during working hours, 5 of the 6 cabinets stood open. Benjamin pulled reference materials constantly, old surveys, historical maps, field notes from previous jobs that might inform current work. Only the 6th cabinet, the one containing completed surveys awaiting delivery to clients, stayed locked. This morning, all 6 were locked. Thomas tried each handle in turn, though he knew after the first one what he would find. The brass was cool under his fingers. The mechanisms did not give even slightly. He stood back and looked at the cabinets as a group, trying to see them the way Benjamin would. 6 identical pieces of furniture, each containing what? Thomas had worked here 3 years. He had opened these cabinets 1,000 times. Supplies in the first one, ink, paper, drafting tools, reference maps in the second and third, historical surveys of Essex County, coastal charts, township plats, field books in the 4th, organized by year, instruments awaiting repair in the 5th, completed work in the 6th, common things, ordinary things, the material substance of a surveying practice. Why lock them all? Thomas went to the small office at the back of the workshop where Benjamin kept the business records. The desk there, a plain piece, nothing like the custom cabinets, was as empty as the drafting table. The account ledgers that Thomas himself had been reviewing with Benjamin 2 days ago were gone. Not misfiled, not left open to a working page. Gone. The desk drawers were not locked. Thomas opened each one. Empty except for basic supplies, a pen stand, a knife for sharpening quills, a stick of sealing wax, a sand shaker. The things too mundane to be worth removing. He sat in Benjamin's chair and put his hands flat on the empty desk. The wood was smooth, worn in the center where years of paperwork had been pushed back and forth. There was a slight depression where Benjamin habitually rested his right forearm while writing. Thomas tried to remember exactly what Benjamin had said when he left Tuesday evening. Had there been anything? Any indication? Any shift in his manner that might, in retrospect, look like preparation? He could not remember. Benjamin had been working. Thomas had said good night. Benjamin had made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been simple awareness that someone had spoken. Thomas had left. 16 hours later, or perhaps less. Thomas did not know when during the night this transformation had occurred. The workshop had been closed, not abandoned. Closed. The distinction mattered in a way Thomas was only beginning to understand. He waited until noon. This was perhaps foolish, but he could not quite bring himself to raise an alarm about a man who might simply be ill at home or delayed by some ordinary circumstance. At noon, with the workshop still empty and the quality of the silence beginning to feel less like absence and more like statement, Thomas locked the door and walked to the house on Federal Street where Benjamin rented rooms. The landlady, a widow named Mrs. Kern, who kept a clean house and minded her business to a degree that Benjamin had apparently found ideal, opened the door and looked at Thomas with the neutral expression of someone who has been interrupted during domestic work. Thomas asked if Mr. Lowe was at home. Mrs. Kern said he was not. He had left early yesterday morning, very early, before dawn. She had heard him on the stairs. He had been carrying a case of some kind. She had not seen it clearly in the darkness, but she had heard the weight of it in his step. Had he said where he was going? He had not. Mr. Lowe was not a man given to explaining his movements, and Mrs. Kern was not a woman given to asking. He paid his rent on time. He was quiet. He did not entertain visitors or keep irregular hours. Beyond that, what a man did with his days was his own concern. Was there anything unusual in his rooms? Mrs. Kern's expression shifted slightly, the neutrality acquiring a thin edge of affront. She did not enter her tenants' rooms uninvited. She kept a respectable house. Thomas apologized and asked if she might, given the unusual circumstances of Mr. Lowe's extended absence from his place of business, be willing to check whether his personal effects were still in residence. Mrs. Kern considered this. Then she went upstairs. She was gone perhaps 5 minutes. When she returned, her expression had changed again. Not worried. Thomas did not think Mrs. Kern was a woman who worried easily, but uncertain in a way that suggested she had found something outside her normal frame of reference. Mr. Lowe's rooms were empty. Not disturbed, not ransacked. Empty. The furniture remained. It was her furniture after all. But his personal belongings were gone. His clothes, his books, the small items a man accumulated in 2 years of residence. Gone. The rooms looked, Mrs. Kern said with the precision of someone choosing her words carefully, as though they had been prepared for a new tenant. Thomas thanked her and walked back to Charter Street in the May sunshine. He did not go into the workshop. He sat on the steps outside and watched the street traffic, carts, horses, men moving between the warehouses and the docks, and tried to fit what he knew into some shape that made sense. Benjamin Lowe had left Salem before dawn on May 2nd, carrying something heavy enough to affect his gait. He had left behind a workshop locked and organized with the same precision he brought to his surveys. He had left behind no note, no explanation, no forwarding information. He had taken his personal effects from his rented rooms and left them in a state that suggested he did not intend to return. This was not a disappearance. This was a departure. Planned, methodical, complete. But why? And why the locked cabinets? Thomas went home to his boarding house and spent the evening staring at the ceiling. The next day he returned to the workshop. It remained locked and perfect and empty. He stood in the street outside and felt the question growing larger. Not where had Benjamin gone. Thomas was beginning to accept that he might never know that. But what had Benjamin been doing before he left? And what was in the locked cabinets that required them all to be secured? On the third day, Thomas went to the county courthouse. The clerk, a narrow man named Halstead, who had worked there long enough to remember when the building was new, looked up from his desk with the expression of someone whose day has been interrupted by a question he would prefer not to answer. Thomas asked if Mr. Lowe had filed any notices, travel plans, business closure, anything that might explain his absence. Halstead checked the files with the slow thoroughness of a man who is making very clear that this is an imposition. No notices. No recent filings. The last business Mr. Lowe had conducted with the county was 3 weeks prior. A township boundary survey, accepted without question, as Mr. Lowe's surveys always were. Thomas asked if there had been any disputes involving Mr. Lowe's work, any challenges, any complaints, any reason someone might wish him gone. Halstead set down the file he was holding and looked at Thomas with something approaching pity. Mr. Lowe's work was not disputed. His measurements were the standard. If two parties disagreed about a property line, they paid Mr. Lowe to settle it, because they knew the court would accept his survey as final. The notion that someone would have cause to challenge his work was, Halstead's expression suggested, evidence that Thomas understood very little about how these things worked. Thomas thanked him and left. He stood on the courthouse steps and watched people move through the square. Women with market baskets, men in conversation, a dog sleeping in the shade, and felt completely alone with what he knew, which was nothing, and what he suspected, which was growing into something he did not want to examine too closely. That afternoon he went back to the workshop and stood before the 6 locked cabinets for a long time. Then he went to the hardware store on Essex Street and purchased a pry bar. It felt like theft. It felt like violation. It felt necessary in a way he could not articulate, but could not ignore. The first cabinet took him most of the afternoon. The lock was good. Benjamin would not have accepted inferior hardware, and the wood was solid oak that resisted the pry bar's leverage. Thomas worked carefully, trying to minimize the damage, though he knew there was no version of this that would not leave visible evidence of forced entry. The doorframe splintered gradually, long splinters of pale wood curling away from the dark grain, until finally the bolt tore free and the door swung open. Field books, dozens of them, more than Thomas had ever seen in the 4th cabinet where Benjamin kept his official field notes. These were shelved with the same obsessive order, chronological, labeled by date on the spine, but they were separate, a complete parallel set. Thomas pulled the first one down. April 1842, the month Benjamin had opened the workshop, the month he had begun his career as an independent surveyor in Salem. He opened it to the first entry. The handwriting was unmistakably Benjamin's, that careful, controlled script that made every letter identical to every other letter of its kind. The handwriting of a man who understood that documentation was permanent and therefore had to be perfect. The survey was the Harrod property. Thomas knew it. Everyone in Salem knew it. It had been one of Benjamin's first major commissions, a boundary survey for a property dispute that had been running through the courts for years. Benjamin's survey had settled it. The precision of his measurements, the clarity of his documentation, had made further argument impossible. The survey hung in the courthouse. It had established Benjamin's reputation. Thomas read the field notes carefully. Location, weather conditions, instrument readings, calculations. All standard. All exactly what field notes should contain. Except the measurements were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of error. Thomas had been trained by Benjamin, and he knew competent measurement from incompetent. These measurements were precise, verified through multiple methods, documented with the same rigor as every survey Benjamin conducted. They were wrong in the sense that they did not match the official survey hanging in the courthouse. The bearing was off by 3 degrees. The distance was short by 4 chains. Small differences. The kind of differences that might be instrument error if you were being generous, or transcription error if you were being very generous. But Benjamin did not make errors. Thomas felt something cold move through his chest. He set the first field book down and pulled 3 more at random. He knew all of these surveys: the Morrison boundary, the Endicott lot, the Salem Harbor waterfront survey that had determined pier placements for the past 6 years. In every case, the measurements in the private field books differed from the official surveys. Not wildly, nothing that would attract immediate attention, but consistently, systematically, in ways that, when Thomas traced them through, shifted property lines in very specific directions. Land that should have belonged to families named Gowan and Teller and Marsh, his own name, he noticed with a sick feeling, belonged instead to families named Crowninshield and Darby and Silsby. Water rights that should have been shared were documented as exclusive. Easements that should have existed were absent from the official record. He read until the light failed. He did not light a lamp. He sat on the workshop floor with field books stacked around him and felt the shape of what Benjamin had been doing settle over him like something physical and cold. For 7 years, Benjamin Lowe had been filing false surveys. Not incompetently false. They were too carefully constructed for that. Deliberately false. Altered in small, precise ways that transferred property and wealth from families without power to families with it. And for 7 years, he had been documenting the truth in a parallel record that he showed no one and locked in a cabinet in his workshop. Until 4 days ago, when he had taken whatever he could carry, locked everything else, and left. Thomas closed the last field book and sat in the darkness. His hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. He was not afraid. From something else. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition that he had been working beside a man for 3 years and had not seen him at all. Benjamin had been building something. Not a career. He had that. Not a reputation. He had that too, and it was false. And he had constructed it with the same precision he brought to everything. He had been building evidence. A record so complete, so methodical, so impossible to dismiss that when it was finally used, it would unravel everything. But used how? And by whom? And where was Benjamin now? Thomas went home. He did not sleep. He lay in his rented room and listened to the sounds of the boarding house. Footsteps in the hallway, voices through thin walls, the creak of floorboards as the building settled, and tried to decide what to do with what he knew. In the morning, he went back to the workshop and carefully replaced all the field books in the cabinet. He tried to push the splintered door closed. It would not latch, but it would stay shut if no one touched it. He sat at Benjamin's drafting table and put his head in his hands. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning when Thomas was attempting to handle a small survey request from a client who did not yet know that the surveyor he had hired had disappeared, Halstead appeared at the workshop door. He was holding an envelope. Large, heavy paper, sealed with wax. It had arrived at the courthouse that morning, addressed to the county clerk, marked for the attention of the Superior Court. Halstead had opened it in his official capacity and found something that he believed Mr. Marsh, as Mr. Lowe's assistant, should probably see. Thomas took the envelope. Inside was a map of Salem Township, rendered in Benjamin's unmistakable hand. Beautiful work. Every line clean, every label perfectly positioned, every measurement documented with the obsessive precision that was Benjamin's signature. The property boundaries did not match the official township map. Not wildly, but consistently in dozens of small ways that Thomas, who had spent weeks now reading the private field books, recognized immediately. This was the true map. The correction. Attached was a letter, brief and clear. The enclosed survey represents accurate measurements of Salem Township boundaries as verified by astronomical observation, triangulation from established benchmarks, and physical evidence of original survey markers placed during the 1804 colonial survey. Discrepancies between this survey and the current official record are not errors, but corrections. Complete documentation supporting each correction is available upon request through the Office of Whitman and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Portland, Maine. Benjamin Lowe, Licensed Surveyor, Essex County, Massachusetts. The letter was dated May 15, 1849. The postmark was Boston. Thomas read it twice. Then he looked up at Halstead, who was watching him with an expression that suggested he had already understood some of what this meant and was waiting for Thomas to catch up. "What do we do with this?" Halstead asked. It was not really a question. Thomas looked down at the map, at the clean lines and careful measurements and the signature at the bottom that he had seen 1,000 times on survey documents. He thought about the locked cabinets and the empty workshop and the man who had spent 7 years documenting a truth that would destroy him if he stayed to deliver it himself. "We verify it," Thomas said. His voice sounded strange to him, steadier than he felt. "We verify every measurement. We compare it to the official record. We do exactly what anyone would do if Benjamin Lowe walked in here and handed us a survey that contradicted existing documentation. And if it's accurate, then we have a problem," Thomas said. "A very large problem." Halstead nodded slowly. He took the envelope back and left. Thomas sat alone in the workshop. Through the tall windows, the May light fell in the same angled beams it always had, turning dust into geometry and making the brass instruments glow like small suns. He wondered where Benjamin was, whether he was somewhere watching to see if the map would be taken seriously, whether he had already moved on to whatever came after this, the next city, the next name, the next life, built with the same careful precision he had brought to everything. Thomas stood and walked to the forced cabinet. He opened the door. It swung freely now, the lock destroyed, and looked at the rows of field books. 7 years of truth, locked away, waiting. He pulled the first book from the shelf and carried it to the drafting table. Then he went back for the second and the third, and by the time the afternoon light began to fail, he had stacked 43 field books on the table in chronological order. Tomorrow he would begin reading them all, properly this time, documenting what Benjamin had documented, preparing to verify what Benjamin had spent 7 years building. Tonight, he sat in the workshop as the light faded and felt the weight of what was coming settle over him. Not dread, exactly. Something else. The feeling of standing at the edge of something vast that had been hidden and was now beginning, with terrible slowness, to reveal itself. Outside, Salem went about its evening business. Inside, in a workshop on Charter Street, the evidence of what had been done to it sat in neat stacks on a pine table, waiting to be read by someone who finally understood what he was looking at. Benjamin Lowe had not made errors. He had made corrections, and he had made them so carefully, so completely, that when they finally arrived, and they would arrive, Thomas was certain of that now, they would be impossible to ignore. The maps arrived like a slow drumbeat through the summer of 1849, each one perfectly timed to land just as the previous one was being taken seriously. Thomas tracked them on a chart he kept in the workshop, pinned to the wall where Benjamin's slate board had once hung. Each arrival marked with a date, a location, a postmark. Boston, Portland, Providence, Portsmouth, New Haven, Worcester. Cities scattered across New England in no pattern Thomas could discern, except that none of them were close enough together to suggest a route, and none of them were far enough apart to be impossible. Benjamin was moving, carefully, never staying long enough to be found, never going far enough to lose track of what was happening behind him. The second map had arrived in Marblehead on June 3rd, addressed to the town's selectmen. It corrected a waterfront survey from 1844 that had, according to Benjamin's meticulous documentation, transferred 300 feet of commercially valuable dock frontage from a fishermen's cooperative to a shipping concern owned by men whose names appeared regularly in the state legislature. The Marblehead selectmen had forwarded it to the county with a tersely worded note, asking whether the signature Benjamin Lowe was the same surveyor whose work they had been relying on for 5 years, and if so, whether any of his previous surveys could now be considered reliable. It was a reasonable question. It was the question that would eventually unravel everything, which was, Thomas had come to understand, exactly what Benjamin had intended. The third map went to Beverly, the fourth to Gloucester, the fifth back to Salem, this time correcting an inland property survey that had been used to settle an estate dispute in 1846. Each one was accompanied by the same brief letter referencing documentation available through Whitman and Associates in Portland. Each one was postmarked from a different city. Each one was absolutely accurate. Thomas knew they were accurate because he was checking them. It had become his entire occupation. The small survey jobs that still came to the workshop, from clients who had not yet heard about the maps, or who had heard and did not care, or who understood that Thomas Marsh had been trained by Benjamin Lowe, and therefore knew how to use a transit. These he completed quickly and without much attention. The rest of his time, all of it, went to verification. He worked through Benjamin's private field books in chronological order, cross-referencing them against the official surveys, then going into the field himself with instruments and notebooks to check the measurements against physical reality. It was painstaking work, the kind of work that required clear weather and good light and absolute concentration. The kind of work Benjamin had spent 7 years doing while simultaneously maintaining the false record that everyone trusted. By mid-June, Thomas had verified 12 surveys. In every case, Benjamin's private documentation was correct, and the official survey was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. The errors were always small enough to seem plausible as mistakes. But they were not mistakes. They were adjustments. Systematic, directional, profitable adjustments that had moved property lines in favor of specific families over the course of 7 years. Thomas began to see the pattern. It was not random. It was not opportunistic. It was structural. The families who lost land or rights in these surveys were families without legal representation, without connections to the county offices, without the resources to commission independent verification of work performed by a surveyor of Benjamin Lowe's reputation. Fishermen, small farmers, widows managing inherited property, people who signed documents they could not fully read and trusted measurements they had no ability to check. The families who gained were families whose names appeared on bank charters and shipping registries and mill incorporations. Families who sat on town boards and county commissions. Families who had, in several cases that Thomas documented with growing unease, personally recommended Benjamin Lowe for the survey work that had then redistributed property in their favor. It was elegant. It was patient. It was supported by the entire social structure of a system that assumed men of Benjamin's class and education and professional standing were inherently trustworthy, and that the people who lost in these transactions were inherently unable to challenge them. And Benjamin had documented every single instance of it with the same meticulous care he brought to the false surveys themselves. Thomas sat in the workshop on a warm evening in late June with field books stacked around him, and tried to understand the mind that had done this. Not the false surveys, those he understood, or thought he did. Corruption was common enough. Self-interest was common enough. The willingness to use professional authority to extract wealth from people with less power was, Thomas was coming to realize, the foundation on which much of Salem's prosperity rested. What Thomas could not fully grasp was the parallel documentation, the private field books. The 7 years of maintaining a perfect record of truth alongside a perfect record of falsehood. The extraordinary discipline that required. The daily performance of being Benjamin Lowe, trusted surveyor, while simultaneously being someone else entirely. Someone who was waiting, building, preparing for a moment that would not come until the preparation was complete. Why wait 7 years? Why not expose the corruption after the first survey, the second, the fifth? Why participate in it at all if the goal was eventually to reveal it? Thomas thought about this until his head ached. Then he thought about it more, because the answer mattered. It mattered to understanding what was happening now, in the summer of 1849, as the maps continued to arrive and the county offices continued to forward them to the state authorities. And the state authorities continued to do what authorities always did when confronted with evidence that the systems they oversaw were compromised. They tried to make it go away quietly. The first official response came in early July, in the form of a letter from the Massachusetts Secretary of State's office to the Essex County Clerk. Thomas saw it, because Halstead brought it to the workshop personally, his narrow face tight with something that looked like anger but might have been fear. The letter acknowledged receipt of multiple survey corrections attributed to Benjamin Lowe. It noted that Mr. Lowe's professional credentials were in good standing. It requested that Mr. Lowe appear in person to present his documentation and answer questions about the methodology that had produced measurements differing from previously accepted surveys. It was polite. It was procedural. It was, Thomas understood immediately, an attempt to control the situation by bringing Benjamin into a formal setting where his accusations could be managed, contextualized, and ultimately neutralized by men who had decades of experience making inconvenient truths disappear into the machinery of official process. Halstead stood in the workshop doorway and asked Thomas if he had any way of contacting Mr. Lowe. Any idea where he might be? Any sense of whether he would respond to an official summons? Thomas said he did not. It was true. He had no more idea where Benjamin was than the Secretary of State's office did. Halstead looked at the stacks of field books on the drafting table, at the chart on the wall tracking the arriving maps, at Thomas himself, and seemed to be calculating something. Then he asked a different question. Are they accurate? The maps he's sending, are they actually correct? Thomas met his eyes and felt the weight of what his answer would mean. Not just for himself, not just for Benjamin, but for every survey Benjamin had ever conducted, every property line he had ever drawn, every legal settlement that had relied on his measurements. Yes, Thomas said. They're correct. Halstead was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the street sounds of Salem continued, carts, voices, the bell from the East Church marking the hour. Inside the workshop, the silence had a quality that Thomas recognized from the morning he had first found the locked cabinets. The silence of something large and hidden beginning to move into the light. God help us, Halstead said quietly. Then he left. The maps kept coming. Ipswich, Lynn, Danvers, Newburyport, each one correcting surveys from different years, different properties, different circumstances, each one chipping away at the foundation of trust that allowed the system to function. By August, the county had hired an independent surveyor from Boston, a man named Carlisle with credentials from Harvard and no connection to Essex County, to verify a sample of Benjamin's corrections. Carlisle spent 3 weeks in the field with a crew of assistants and instruments borrowed from the county, remeasuring boundaries that had been settled years ago. His report arrived in early September. Thomas heard about it from Halstead, who came to the workshop looking like he had not slept well in some time. Carlisle had verified 8 of Benjamin's corrections. All 8 were accurate. The official surveys were wrong, consistently wrong, wrong in ways that Carlisle's carefully worded report described as unlikely to be the result of standard measurement error. Halstead set the report on Thomas's drafting table and stood looking at it as though it were something venomous. "This is going to court," he said. "Multiple courts. Property disputes going back 7 years, families demanding their land back, title companies refusing to honor deeds. The whole county's going to be in litigation for a decade." Thomas said nothing. There was nothing to say. Halstead was right. "Do you think he knew?" Halstead asked. "When he was doing these surveys, filing false measurements. Do you think he knew it would come to this?" Thomas looked at the field books stacked on every available surface of the workshop. 7 years of documentation, 7 years of patient, methodical preparation, 7 years of building a case so complete that when it finally detonated, it would be impossible to contain. "Yes," Thomas said. He knew exactly what would happen. Halstead nodded slowly. He picked up Carlisle's report and left without saying anything else. Thomas sat alone in the workshop and thought about Benjamin, about where he might be at this moment, whether he was reading newspapers from Massachusetts, tracking the progression of chaos he had set in motion, whether he felt satisfaction or regret, or simply relief that it was finally happening, that the thing he had been building for 7 years was finally doing what he had designed it to do. The field books told Thomas many things about Benjamin Lowe's technical skill and professional discipline and capacity for sustained deception. They told him nothing about what Benjamin had felt during those 7 years, whether the double life had been difficult or easy, whether maintaining the false surveys while documenting the truth had required conscious effort every day, or had become, after a while, simply another kind of precision work. Thomas found himself wondering, in the long evenings alone in the workshop, whether Benjamin had wanted to stop, whether there had been moments, after the 10th false survey, the 20th, the 50th, when the weight of what he was doing had made him want to simply walk away from all of it, stop filing the corrections, stop documenting the truth, take his reputation and his skills and move to another city where no one knew him and start over with a clean record. But he had not done that. He had continued for 7 years. And the only explanation Thomas could arrive at was that Benjamin had decided, at some point early in this process, that simply stopping was not enough. That walking away would leave the false surveys in place, the stolen property unrecovered, the system that enabled it all intact and functional. So he had stayed. And he had built something that would outlast his departure, something that would continue to work even after he was gone, like a clock wound carefully and set running. The maps were the mechanism, the field books were the weights and springs. And Thomas, sitting in the workshop verifying measurements and answering questions from county officials and slowly becoming the public face of Benjamin Lowe's methodical demolition of Essex County's property records, was the pendulum. In late September, the first lawsuit was filed. A fisherman's widow named Abrams, represented by an attorney from Boston who had apparently been contacted by the mysterious firm of Whitman and Associates in Portland, sued to recover waterfront property that had been transferred through a survey Benjamin had conducted in 1845. The defendant was a shipping concern owned by 3 men, 2 of whom sat on the Salem Harbor Commission. The case was assigned to the Superior Court. The presiding judge requested all relevant surveys and documentation. Thomas spent 2 days preparing the materials. Benjamin's official survey from 1845, clean and precise and wrong. Benjamin's private field notes from the same survey, equally clean, equally precise, correct. Carlyle's independent verification, confirming the discrepancy. A map showing the property line according to each survey, the difference amounting to 300 feet of waterfront that had been, according to Benjamin's documentation, deliberately moved. He delivered the materials to the court personally and watched the clerk's face as he paged through them. The clerk was young, probably new to the position, and his expression moved from professional neutrality to confusion to something that looked like nausea as he understood what he was looking at. "How many of these are there?" the clerk asked. "Cases like this, surveys that were wrong." Thomas had been preparing for this question. He had counted. 47 surveys over 7 years where Benjamin's private documentation differed significantly from the official record. 47 potential lawsuits. 47 properties where someone had gained and someone had lost, and where the documentation now existed to prove it. 47, Thomas said. The clerk set down the papers and looked at Thomas with an expression that contained no hostility, only a kind of exhausted recognition that his job had just become much more complicated. "Jesus," he said quietly. Then he logged the materials and gave Thomas a receipt. The lawsuit moved forward. 3 more were filed in October. By November, there were 8 active cases, all of them involving property that had been surveyed by Benjamin Lowe, all of them relying on the private field books that Thomas had found in the locked cabinet. The defendant's attorneys tried multiple approaches. They challenged Benjamin's credentials, unsuccessfully, since his professional standing was documented and unimpeachable. They challenged the authenticity of the private field books, unsuccessfully, since the handwriting was verified and the measurements could be independently confirmed. They challenged the legal standing of corrections to surveys that had been officially accepted years ago. This one had more traction and produced lengthy procedural arguments about statute of limitations and the finality of settled property rights. But the core problem remained. The measurements in Benjamin's private documentation were correct. The measurements in the official surveys were wrong. And the pattern of those errors was too consistent, too directional, too profitable to specific parties to be explained as innocent mistakes. In December, the Massachusetts Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into surveying practices in Essex County. Thomas was called to testify. He brought the field books, all of them, and spent 6 hours in a room with 3 attorneys and a stenographer, walking through the documentation page by page. They asked him about Benjamin, about his character, his work habits, his relationships with clients, about whether he had ever mentioned the private surveys, ever indicated that he was documenting anything beyond his official work. Thomas answered carefully and truthfully. No, Benjamin had never mentioned the private surveys. No, there had been no indication that he was maintaining a parallel record. Yes, he had been an exacting teacher and a precise surveyor. Yes, his professional reputation had been earned through consistently excellent work. No, Thomas had never suspected anything until the morning he found the workshop locked and perfect and empty. The attorneys made notes. The stenographer's pen scratched steadily across page after page. Thomas sat in a wooden chair and felt the strange dissociation of describing a man he had worked beside for 3 years and realized now he had never known at all. At the end of the session, the lead attorney, a tired-looking man named Morrison, who had the air of someone who had handled many difficult cases and found this one particularly thankless, asked Thomas if he had any idea where Benjamin Lowe might be. Thomas said he did not. It was still true. The postmarks on the maps had stopped revealing patterns after the first dozen. They came from everywhere and nowhere. Boston one week, Burlington the next, then back to Providence, then up to Portland. Benjamin was moving through New England like water, present everywhere briefly and nowhere long enough to be contained. Morrison nodded as though he had expected this answer. He asked if Thomas thought Benjamin would ever return to Massachusetts. Thomas considered the question. He thought about the locked cabinets and the empty workshop and the 7 years of patient documentation. He thought about a man who had participated in a corrupt system long enough to understand it completely, then dismantled it from within with such precision that no one had seen it coming until it was too late to stop. No, Thomas said. I don't think he's coming back. Morrison made a final note and dismissed him. Thomas walked out of the building into a cold December afternoon and stood on the steps watching people move through the streets of Boston and wondered if Benjamin was somewhere in this city right now, walking these same streets under a different name, watching to see whether the machinery he had set in motion would continue to run without him. The investigation continued through the winter. More lawsuits were filed. More surveys were challenged. The scope of what Benjamin had documented expanded with each case until it became clear that this was not a matter of a few corrupt officials or a few questionable surveys. It was systematic. It was organized. It involved county officials, prominent families, attorneys who had facilitated the property transfers, and a surveyor who had been, for 7 years, the trusted instrument through which the system operated, until the instrument had decided to document everything and leave. In February of 1850, Thomas received a letter. It came to the workshop, addressed to him personally, postmarked from Philadelphia. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No signature, no return address, just 3 sentences in handwriting that Thomas recognized with a jolt that was almost physical. The documentation is complete. What happens next is no longer in my hands. I trust you will use it well. Thomas read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He sat at the drafting table in the workshop that had been Benjamin's and was now his, and looked at the field books that had become the foundation of 8 lawsuits and a state investigation and, probably, when everything finally settled, a complete restructuring of how property surveys were conducted and verified in Massachusetts. He thought about responding, about sending a letter to Philadelphia or to whatever city Benjamin moved to next, telling him that yes, the documentation was being used, that the cases were moving forward, that the system he had exposed was slowly, painfully being reformed. But he did not know what address to send such a letter to, and he suspected that Benjamin did not need to be told, that wherever he was tracking this, reading newspapers, following the court proceedings from a distance, watching the thing he had built continue to function exactly as he had designed it to. Thomas pulled a fresh field book from the supply cabinet. Not one of Benjamin's, a new one, blank, and opened it to the first page. He wrote the date. He wrote his own name. He wrote the first survey assignment he had accepted as an independent surveyor, working out of the workshop on Charter Street that still carried Benjamin Lowe's name on the door. Outside, winter light fell through the tall windows and turned the brass instruments into small fires. Inside, Thomas began the work of measuring things accurately and documenting them honestly and building, page by page, the kind of record that could be trusted. He did not know if it would be enough to repair what had been broken, but he knew how to measure things. Benjamin had taught him that, and he knew that documentation mattered. Benjamin had proven that. The rest would have to be enough. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus the Essex County Land Office began on March 12, 1851, in a courtroom that was too small for the number of people who wanted to witness it. Thomas arrived early and still had to stand against the back wall, pressed between a newspaper reporter from Boston and a man he recognized as one of the defendant's attorneys, taking notes on anyone who entered. The case had taken 2 years to reach this point. 2 years of preliminary hearings and motions and procedural challenges. 2 years of attorneys arguing about whether surveys could be retroactively challenged, whether private documentation could be admitted as evidence against official records, whether the statute of limitations applied to fraud that had been successfully concealed until the fraudulent party chose to reveal it. The judge was a man named Washburn, brought in from Worcester specifically because he had no connections to Essex County and no history with any of the parties involved. He was in his 60s, with the measured manner of someone who had spent decades watching people lie under oath and had developed a constitutional inability to be surprised by human venality. The prosecution opened with the Abrams case. The fisherman's widow, now represented by 3 attorneys from Boston working on contingency, sat in the front row wearing black and holding a handkerchief she did not use. She had, Thomas knew from the pre-trial documentation, lost her husband to influenza in 1848 and her waterfront property to a survey Benjamin Lowe had conducted in 1845. The property was worth, at current valuation, approximately $8,000. She lived in a boarding house in Marblehead and took in sewing. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They entered Benjamin's official survey from 1845 as Exhibit A. They entered Benjamin's private field notes from the same survey as Exhibit B. They entered Carlyle's independent verification as Exhibit C. They called Carlyle himself to testify about his methodology and findings. Carlyle was a dry, precise man who spoke about surveying the way a carpenter might speak about wood, as a material reality that could be measured accurately or inaccurately, but which did not care about human intentions either way. He testified that the official survey contained measurements that were incorrect by amounts ranging from 3 degrees to 7 chains. He testified that these errors were consistent in direction and effect, moving the property line in favor of the defendant. He testified that in his professional opinion, errors of this magnitude and consistency were not plausible as accidents. The defense attorney objected to the characterization. Judge Washburn sustained the objection but noted in his ruling that the question of intent was separate from the question of accuracy, and that the court would address each in turn. The defense called their own surveyor, a man from Salem named Pritchard, who had worked in Essex County for 20 years, and who testified that measurement errors were common, that instruments could drift, that weather and terrain and human fatigue all contributed to variations in survey work. He testified that Benjamin Lowe's official survey fell within acceptable tolerances for work of that era. On cross-examination, the prosecution asked Pritchard if he had actually verified any of the measurements in question by going into the field and remeasuring them himself. He had not. They asked if he was familiar with Benjamin Lowe's reputation for precision. He was very familiar. Benjamin's work had been the standard in the county. They asked if, given that reputation, he found it plausible that Benjamin would make consistent errors in a single direction across multiple measurement points. Pritchard hesitated. The courtroom was very quiet. Thomas, standing against the back wall, could hear the scratch of the court reporter's pen. "It would be unusual," Pritchard said finally. The prosecution thanked him and sat down. The trial continued for 3 weeks. More surveyors testified. County officials testified about the procedures for accepting and filing surveys. Attorneys for the defendant argued that the official survey had been accepted in good faith, that property rights had been established on its basis, that overturning it now would create chaos in land titles throughout the county. They were not wrong about the chaos. Thomas knew this because he was living in the middle of it. The workshop on Charter Street had become an informal archive for anyone trying to sort out which surveys could be trusted and which could not. Attorneys came with property descriptions and asked Thomas to check whether Benjamin had surveyed them. Title companies came with deed maps and asked for verification. Families who had lost property came with old documents and hope that had been carefully preserved for years in the understanding that hope was sometimes all that survived injustice. Thomas worked through them all methodically. He had hired an assistant, a young man named Peter who was learning surveying and did not seem troubled by the fact that his teacher's teacher had built a career on systematic fraud before demolishing it. Peter handled the routine inquiries while Thomas focused on the cases that were moving toward litigation. There were, by spring of 1851, 23 active lawsuits. The Abrams case was the test. If the prosecution won, if Judge Washburn ruled that private documentation could overturn an officially accepted survey, the remaining cases would likely settle. If the defense won, the entire structure of Benjamin's revelation would collapse into a pile of interesting but legally irrelevant papers. The verdict came on April 3rd. Thomas was not in the courtroom. He was in the field, verifying measurements for one of the pending cases. But he heard about it within an hour. A runner from Halstead's office found him at the old Herod property, standing in spring mud with a transit, and delivered the news in a breathless rush that suggested he had run the entire way from the courthouse. The prosecution had won. Judge Washburn had ruled that evidence of fraud vitiated official acceptance, that surveys procured through deception could not establish legitimate property rights, and that the waterfront property would be returned to the Abrams estate. The runner left. Thomas stood alone in the field with his transit and looked at the property line he was measuring. It ran through a stand of oak trees, marked by stones that had been placed there in 1842, according to Benjamin's private notes, and moved 6 feet north in the official survey that same year. 6 feet. The difference between one family keeping their land and another family taking it. He finished the measurements. He recorded them in his field book with the same careful precision Benjamin had taught him. He packed his instruments and walked back to Salem through afternoon light that turned the still bare trees into stark geometries against a pale sky. The settlements began in May. 18 of the remaining 22 cases settled out of court, the defendants apparently deciding that Judge Washburn's ruling had made litigation an expensive way to lose. The properties were returned, or in cases where return was impractical, compensation was paid. The amounts were substantial. The families who received them were, in several cases, people who had been living at the edge of poverty for years. Thomas attended one of the settlement conferences as a witness. He watched a woman named Cray, who had lost her family's farm in 1844, sign documents that gave her back 40 acres and 7 years of back rent from the man who had been farming it. She was in her 70s, and her hands shook as she signed, and when the attorney handed her the deed, she held it for a long moment without speaking, just looking at it as though it were written in a language she had forgotten how to read. The remaining 4 cases went to trial. All 4 resulted in verdicts for the prosecution. By autumn of 1851, the legal structure of Benjamin's revelation was complete. The surveys had been overturned. The properties had been returned. The system that had enabled the fraud was being reformed through new regulations requiring independent verification of all surveys and public posting of measurement data. The county officials who had accepted the false surveys were investigated. 2 resigned. 1 was prosecuted for accepting bribes, though the evidence was circumstantial, and he was eventually acquitted. The shipping concerns and mill companies that had profited from the false surveys paid settlements and issued statements expressing shock that they had been unwitting participants in fraud. No one believed the statements, but no one could prove they were lies, and the statements served their purpose of allowing everyone to move forward without having to acknowledge that the system had been working exactly as designed. Thomas watched all of this from the workshop on Charter Street. He gave testimony when called. He verified measurements when asked. He maintained the field books that had become the documentary foundation of the largest property redistribution in Massachusetts history. And he wondered, constantly, where Benjamin was and whether he knew what his 7 years of patient documentation had accomplished. The answer came in November of 1851, in the form of a package addressed to Thomas personally, postmarked from Chicago. Inside was a surveyor's compass. Old, well-made, the brass worn smooth from years of handling. Thomas recognized it immediately. It was Benjamin's personal compass, the one he had carried in the field, the one he had used to take the measurements in the private field books. There was no note, no letter, just the compass, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, packed in a wooden box with straw. Thomas unwrapped it and held it in his hands. The brass was cool and heavy. The needle moved freely on its pivot, finding north with the unhesitating precision of a well-maintained instrument. He set it on the drafting table and stared at it for a long time. It was a gift, or a transfer, or a statement. Thomas was not entirely sure which, and suspected it might be all three. Benjamin was done with surveying, done with Massachusetts, done with the work that had defined 7 years of his life and destroyed the reputation he had spent 7 years building. He was somewhere in the Western Territories now. Chicago was not a destination, Thomas understood, but a waypoint. A place to pause before moving further into country where no one knew the name Benjamin Lowe and no one cared about property disputes in Essex County. Thomas picked up the compass again. He opened his own instrument case and set Benjamin's compass inside it, next to the transit and level and measuring chains he used in his daily work. It fit perfectly, as though the case had been designed with space for it. He closed the case and locked it. Then he sat at the drafting table and wrote a letter. He did not know where to send it, but he wrote it anyway, because some things needed to be said even if they would never be read. The cases are finished. 23 lawsuits, 23 victories. The properties have been returned. The system is being reformed. The people you documented, the families who lost land, who lost rights, who lost everything and had no power to challenge it, they have their land back. Not all of them. Some are dead. Some have moved away and cannot be found. But enough. Enough that what you did mattered. I do not know if you intended for me to be the one managing this. I do not know if you planned that far ahead, or if you simply trusted that someone would do what needed to be done once the documentation was available. Either way, I want you to know it was used well as it could be. I do not know if what you did was right. You participated in fraud for 7 years. You filed false surveys. You helped transfer property from people who could not defend themselves to people who could. You did all of this deliberately, methodically, with full knowledge of what you were doing. And then you documented it. You built a case so complete that when it finally came to light, it could not be ignored or dismissed or buried in procedural challenges. You destroyed your own reputation to destroy the system you had been part of. You gave up everything you had built to give back what had been taken. I do not know if that makes it right, but I know it mattered. The woman I watched sign the deed to her family's farm. She wept when she held that paper. Not dramatically. Just quiet tears running down her face while she stared at her own name written in ink. That happened because of what you did. Because you spent 7 years building something that would work even after you were gone. I hope wherever you are, whatever name you are using, whatever life you are building, you know that. I hope you know it was worth it. The compass is sitting on my drafting table. I will carry it in the field. I will use it the way you taught me to use instruments, carefully, precisely, with respect for the fact that measurements matter because they affect people's lives. Thank you for teaching me that. Thank you for trusting me with the documentation. Thank you for being exactly as methodical and patient and impossibly disciplined as you needed to be to make this work. I hope you find whatever you are looking for out there. Thomas signed the letter and sealed it. He addressed it to Benjamin Lowe, Chicago, Illinois, knowing it would never reach him. Knowing Benjamin was already gone from Chicago, probably had been gone before the package was even posted. He kept the letter in his desk drawer. Years later, going through his papers, he would find it again and read it and remember the autumn of 1851, when the last of the cases settled and the field books were finally closed, and the work that Benjamin Lowe had started in 1842 finally, definitively ended. But that was later. In November of 1851, Thomas simply put the letter away and went back to work. The workshop on Charter Street continued to operate. The sign still read, "B. Lowe, Licensed Surveyor," though everyone in Salem knew that Thomas Marsh was the one doing the work now. Thomas thought about changing the sign. He never did. It seemed important somehow to leave Benjamin's name there, a marker of what had been built and what had been destroyed and what had survived the destruction. He took on new clients. He trained new assistants. He conducted surveys with the same exacting precision Benjamin had taught him, and he kept meticulous field notes, and he filed his documentation with the county in the understanding that every measurement he recorded would be checked and verified and potentially challenged, because that was how the system worked now. The reforms held. The requirement for independent verification became standard practice. The public posting of survey data became mandatory. The casual corruption that had allowed Benjamin's false surveys to stand unchallenged for 7 years became, if not impossible, at least significantly more difficult. It was not perfect. Thomas knew it was not perfect. There were still ways to manipulate measurements, still ways to transfer property through documentation that looked legitimate, but was not. But it was better than it had been. And better was, Thomas had learned, sometimes all you could achieve. In 1855, Thomas received a letter from an attorney in Wisconsin. The attorney represented a client who was involved in a property dispute and needed an expert witness familiar with surveying practices in New England. The attorney had heard about Thomas's role in the Essex County cases and wondered if Thomas would be willing to travel to Wisconsin to provide testimony. The letter included a description of the case. It was complicated. A boundary dispute involving measurements taken in the 1840s that had recently been challenged. The attorney mentioned that the original surveyor, a man named B. Lawrence, had unfortunately passed away in 1873, so his testimony was not available, but his field notes had survived and formed the basis of the challenge. Thomas read the letter 3 times. The dates were wrong. 1873 was 20 years in the future. It was clearly a transcription error. But the name, B. Lawrence, and the description of the field notes, meticulous, precise, organized chronologically, resonated in a way that made Thomas set the letter down and stare at nothing for a long moment. He wrote back to the attorney and politely declined. He was too busy with work in Massachusetts. He recommended several other surveyors who might be able to assist. He never heard back from the Wisconsin attorney. He did not follow up. Some questions, he had learned, were better left unanswered. In 1862, the Civil War made questions about property surveys seem trivial. The workshop closed for a year while Thomas served with a Massachusetts regiment, doing engineering work. He came back in 1863, older and quieter, and reopened the workshop. The sign still read, "B. Lowe, Licensed Surveyor." He still did not change it. He married in 1866. A woman named Sarah, who had grown up in Salem and understood without needing to be told that the work Thomas did mattered in ways that went beyond the measurements themselves. They had 3 children. Thomas taught the oldest, a daughter, to use a transit when she was 12. She was good at it, better than Thomas had been at that age. He wondered sometimes if she would take over the practice, but she became a teacher instead. And Thomas hired assistants from among the young men who came to Salem looking for apprenticeships. In 1879, Thomas was asked to give a lecture at Harvard on surveying practices and the reforms that had followed the Essex County cases. He was 61 years old. The Essex County cases were nearly 30 years in the past. Most of the people involved were dead or retired. The system that had been reformed was now simply the system, and young surveyors learned the verification protocols without knowing they had once been radical innovations. Thomas stood in front of a room full of students and talked about measurement precision and documentation standards and the importance of independent verification. He talked about the technical aspects of the reforms. He did not talk about Benjamin Lowe. Afterward, during the question period, a student asked about the surveyor who had exposed the fraud. Asked what had happened to him, whether he had continued practicing, whether he had faced any legal consequences. Thomas said that the surveyor had left Massachusetts and, to the best of his knowledge, had never returned. That no charges had ever been filed because the evidence of fraud had come from the surveyor's own documentation, and prosecuting him would have meant invalidating the very evidence that was being used to return property to its rightful owners. That the legal system had chosen to treat him as a witness rather than a participant, which was technically accurate, even if it was not entirely true. The student asked if Thomas thought that was just. Thomas considered the question. He thought about the compass sitting in his instrument case. He thought about the field books stacked in the workshop archive. He thought about the woman named Cray, signing the deed to her farm with shaking hands. Justice is complicated, Thomas said. What matters is that the land was returned, that the system was reformed, that the people who had been wronged received something approaching remedy. Whether the man who made that possible deserved punishment or gratitude is a question I cannot answer. The student seemed unsatisfied with this response, but did not press further. Thomas finished the lecture and took the train back to Salem. He walked to the workshop in the evening when the light came through the windows at the angle that turned brass into fire. He unlocked the door and stood in the space that had been Benjamin's and was now his, and would someday be someone else's. The field books were still there, on the shelf where Thomas had placed them after the trials ended. 47 surveys, 7 years of documentation, the foundation of everything that had followed. Thomas had been asked several times to donate them to the Massachusetts Historical Society. He had always declined. They belonged here in the workshop where they had been created. He pulled one down at random. 1846, the Merchant's Wharf Survey. He opened it and read the first entry in Benjamin's careful handwriting. Date, location, weather, measurements. All precise, all correct, all documented by a man who had known exactly what he was doing and exactly what it would cost him. Thomas closed the book and returned it to the shelf. He locked the workshop and walked home through streets he had known for 60 years. Sarah was waiting with dinner. His daughter was visiting with her husband and their new baby. They ate together and talked about ordinary things. Later, lying in bed, Thomas thought about the letter he had written in 1851 and never sent. The letter that was still in his desk drawer, sealed, addressed to a man who had probably died under a different name in a place Thomas would never know. He hoped the letter's contents were true, even if the letter itself would never be read. He hoped Benjamin had found whatever he was looking for in the territories. He hoped the compass Thomas still carried in the field had been a deliberate gift, and not simply a piece of equipment Benjamin no longer needed. He hoped, most of all, that somewhere in the years between 1851 and whatever year Benjamin Lowe or B. Lawrence or whoever he had become had finally stopped running, he had found a way to build something that did not require destroying himself to make right. Thomas did not know if any of these hopes were true. He would never know. And that, he had come to understand, was part of what Benjamin had intended. The documentation would survive. The reforms would survive. The returned properties and the reformed system and the precedent of private records overturning official fraud, all of that would survive. But Benjamin himself would not survive. Not as Benjamin Lowe. That man had ceased to exist on the morning of May 2, 1849, when he locked the cabinets and left the workshop perfect and empty. What had survived in his place was the work. And the work, Thomas knew from 30 years of carrying it forward, was enough. It had to be enough, because there was nothing else